Picture this. It's a Tuesday. A fund manager in London, one you've never heard of, one whose name will never appear in a newspaper, picks up the phone and says three words that are about to break something. He doesn't say, roll my position. He doesn't say, cash settle. He says, I want delivery. I want the metal. I want bars. And what happens next isn't chaos. It isn't even drama. What happens next is that a number on a spreadsheet somewhere in lower Manhattan gets a little smaller. And then another call comes. And then another. And that number, which most people on Earth have never looked at and would not know how to interpret if they did, gets smaller again. That is not the beginning of a crisis. That is the end of a very long setup. And by the time you see the word crisis in a headline, the people who understood the setup are already on the other side of it, positioned, protected, waiting for everyone else to catch up. That's what this is about. Not the crisis, the setup. Because the setup is the only part you can actually do something about. I'm going to show you a number today that most financial media treats as a comfort statistic. By the time I'm done, you're going to see it as something closer to a pressure gauge. I'm going to walk you through three separate moments in history, 3 different centuries, 3 different forms of money, where the same mechanism built itself, ran itself, and then resolved itself in exactly the same way. And then I'm going to show you where that mechanism is right now, in the structure of the modern silver market, in the data you can pull up today, in the architecture of a system that has been quietly doing what systems like this always do, building pressure behind a thin wall. But before any of that, the number, 87.17 million ounces. That is the COMEX Registered silver figure, the metal that is officially warranted, officially inventoried, officially standing ready for delivery in the exchange that sets silver's price for the entire world. If you've ever glanced at that figure on a dashboard and felt reassured, I want you to hold on to that feeling, because I'm going to tell you what question you forgot to ask, and the answer changes everything about what that number means. The question is, relative to what? Not relative to last month's figure, not relative to a historical average, relative to the open interest that runs to multiples of that figure, relative to global industrial demand that adds hundreds of millions of ounces of consumption every single year, relative to a monetary system carrying more total debt than at any point in recorded human history, a system where anxiety, when it reaches a threshold, can mobilize capital globally within hours and funnel it into physical assets faster than any mine on Earth can respond. When you measure the registered figure against those denominators instead of against itself, the comfort disappears. What's left is a ratio, and the ratio is the story. Here's the framework that makes this legible. If you approach what I'm about to show you as a series of disconnected historical events, Spain over here, Germany over there, 1971 somewhere else, it looks like history, random, contextual, not applicable. But if you approach it as a mechanism, it looks like engineering. And engineering has rules. When a machine has a specific structure, it has specific failure modes. Those failure modes are predictable in advance by anyone who understands the structure. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is not political. It is closer to thermodynamics. You can argue with a politician. You cannot argue with a ratio when the ratio breaks. The mechanism has 4 stages: setup, expansion, crisis, outcome. Every credit and claim system that has ever collapsed has moved through exactly these 4 stages. The names of the currencies change. The decades change. The particular trigger of stage 3 changes every time. But the physics of what happens when claims multiply faster than the base those claims are redeemable against, that doesn't change. It has never changed. Stage 1 is always the same. There is a constraint, an anchor. It might be gold. It might be silver. It might be the institutional credibility of a central bank whose word people genuinely believe. What matters is that the anchor is real, it is limited in supply, and people trust it enough to build commerce on top of it. The system works. And here is the crucial thing about stage 1. It genuinely works. The stability is not an illusion. The growth is real. That experience of real stability is precisely the thing that makes stage 2 possible. Because you cannot convince people to accept paper promises unless there is a genuine history of those promises being honored. Stage 2 is when the machine discovers what it can get away with. Claims multiply. Not because of a single catastrophic decision, not because of villains in a back room, because the incentives are pointing in one direction and everyone follows them. Governments want to spend without raising taxes. Banks want to lend without holding full reserves. Markets want leverage because leverage amplifies returns in a bull cycle. So derivatives appear. Paper substitutes proliferate. Layered promises stack on top of the anchor, multiplying the effective claims without multiplying the underlying base. And for a long time, this works perfectly. The gap between what's promised and what's actually there just quietly grows, year after year, compounding in the background, until one day the gap is larger than the thing it was supposed to supplement. Stage 3 is when something forces reality back into the picture. It can be anything: A war, a trade shock, a rate reset, a single fund manager in London picking up the phone on a Tuesday. The specific trigger is almost irrelevant. What matters is the effect. More people try to reach through the paper and touch the anchor at once than the system can accommodate. The response is always the same: interventions, rule changes, emergency meetings, speeches about stability. These can manage the optics of the crisis without resolving the underlying arithmetic. The machine can issue more claims. It cannot issue more trust. It cannot issue more physical base. Stage 4 is the outcome. The claims are restructured, defaulted on, or devalued. Sometimes visibly, a country announces it cannot pay. More often quietly, inflation erodes the purchasing power of the paper until the real obligation has been silently canceled. But here is the one constant across every single instance without exception. The anchor reprices upward in terms of the failing claims. The people who held the anchor come through the transition with their wealth preserved. The people who held the promise experience it as disruption, as events nobody could have seen coming. They are wrong about the last part. Someone always sees it coming. The mechanism makes it visible in advance. You just have to know what to look for. Let me prove this 3 times. Once might be a coincidence. Twice is a pattern. 3 times is physics. The first case surprises people most. Because the anchor in this story is not paper. The anchor is actual silver, real metal dug from real mountains. And it still breaks. Which should tell you something important. This mechanism is not about the form of the anchor. It is about the ratio. That ratio can break from either direction. Before Spain opens the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas in the mid-16th century, Europe's money supply is genuinely constrained. Coin is metal. Metal comes from the ground slowly. Commerce expands carefully. When you cannot print the anchor holds its value. Then Spain strikes silver on a scale the world has never seen. Tens of millions of ounces flow from the Americas to Europe across the following decades. And here is where people make the intuitive mistake. They assume that more silver means more wealth. It doesn't. It means more units of account chasing the same stock of real goods. Food, cloth, timber, labor. The production of actual things doesn't accelerate to match the flood of metal. The anchor has been multiplied. The real economy has not. So the price of everything, expressed in silver, has to rise to reflect the new ratio. Historians call what follows the price revolution sustained, widespread inflation across Europe, not for months, but for generations. Wages lag behind prices. Fixed income earners are steadily impoverished, and Spain itself, the entity that should benefit most, now becomes addicted to the inflow. The Habsburg kings used the silver not to build productive capacity but to fund permanent military overextension. Wars in the Netherlands, wars against the Ottoman Empire, wars against England. The silver enables spending that would otherwise be impossible, which means that when the inflow eventually slows, there is no underlying productive base to fill the gap. Spain defaults on its sovereign debt 6 times between 1557 and 1647, not because the king is stupid, not because the advisors are corrupt, because the expansion of the money base created obligations the underlying economy could not honor once the expansion normalized. The anchor was repriced, the empire paid the adjustment cost. Setup, expansion, crisis, outcome. The names are Habsburg and Potosi. The mechanism is universal. Now move forward 3.5 centuries. The anchor is paper. The country is Weimar, Germany. The year is 1919. Germany has lost a world war and signed a peace treaty that imposed reparations larger than the German economy could realistically generate. The new republic is politically fragile, and it faces a fiscal situation that looks from the inside completely impossible to navigate honestly. The choice: genuine austerity or print. Expand the money supply, cover the deficits, buy time. The Weimar government chooses to print. And at first it works. That is the thing nobody who survived it could fully explain afterward, that the expansion felt like a solution. The economy kept moving. This is the most insidious feature of Stage 2. It functions. Every new injection of marks resolves an immediate crisis and pushes the real crisis further into the future. The people making the decisions are not irrational. They are responding rationally to the pressures in front of them. The problem is that rational short-term decisions, made inside a system with a broken anchor, accumulate into an irrational long-term outcome. The snap comes in 1923, and when it comes, it does not arrive gradually. It arrives the way everything in a nonlinear system arrives once the threshold is crossed, suddenly, completely, without warning. In January of that year, $1 American buys around 17,000 German marks. By November, $1 buys 4.2 trillion marks. Workers are paid twice a day because purchasing power is declining between the morning shift and the afternoon shift. A person who had saved diligently their entire life, who had done everything a responsible citizen was supposed to do, that person's life savings bought a loaf of bread, if the bread was still on the shelf when they got there. The people who came through Weimar hyperinflation intact were not primarily the wealthy. They were the people who had, before the threshold crossed, converted paper into real assets, farmland, buildings, physical things whose value was not denominated in a currency being destroyed. They did not necessarily know exactly when the threshold would come, but they understood the mechanism well enough to move before the headline wrote itself. The people who trusted the institution paid the adjustment cost the system demanded. The reset came through a new currency, backed by real assets with strict issuance limits. It works precisely because it imposes constraint. Every attempt to substitute promises for constraint just makes the eventual return more violent. Setup, expansion, crisis, outcome, different names, identical mechanism. Now the third case. Pay close attention here because this one connects directly to where we are right now. After the Second World War, the world's major economies design a new monetary architecture from scratch. The dollar becomes the global reserve currency. Every other major currency is pegged to the dollar, and the dollar is convertible to gold at a fixed rate, $35 per ounce. That is the anchor. And it works. The post-war economy expands. Trade flows. Living standards rise. For roughly 2 decades, the system does exactly what it was designed to do. But stage 2 begins almost immediately. The United States finances wars, first Korea, then Vietnam, without fully taxing their cost. Domestic programs expand. Dollars flow overseas in massive quantities. And foreign governments have the legal right to present those dollars for gold at $35 per ounce. By the mid-1960s, the number of dollars outstanding relative to the gold at Fort Knox has grown to a ratio that would require a fire sale to honor if everyone asked at once. In 1968, the London gold pool collapses under the weight of conversion demand. The anchored price is becoming visibly fictional. Then, on the evening of August 15, 1971, President Nixon appears on television and uses the word suspend. The United States is suspending the convertibility of dollars to gold, effective immediately. Not temporarily, as it turned out, permanently. The anchor is cut, not gradually, not with a transition period, with a Sunday night television address. What follows is the 1970s. Stagflation. Hard assets reprice not modestly but violently. Gold goes from $35 an ounce to more than $800 by 1980. Oil quadruples in 1973 alone. And silver goes on a run that ends in one of the most instructive episodes of the 20th century. By the late 1970s, silver has climbed from under $2 an ounce to nearly $50. People describe this as a story about the Hunt brothers. The Hunt brothers are part of the story, but the deeper story is what happens to a thin, physically constrained market when the collapse of monetary credibility drives capital into hard assets at the same time that industrial demand is expanding. The paper claims on silver cannot be honored at the prevailing price. The market has to clear, and it clears the only way a market can when supply is constrained and demand is spiking. The price goes up, fast, until the mismatch resolves itself. The exchange's response is instructive. Rule changes. Margin increases. Restrictions on new long positions. The paper layer is forcibly deflated. The price collapses, not because the physical reality changed, not because new mines opened, but because the institution rewrote the rules to shrink the paper. Remember that response, because it is coming again. Setup, expansion, crisis, outcome. 3 eras, 3 different forms of money, 1 mechanism. Now bring it to today. The anchor in our era is not gold. It is something more abstract and therefore more fragile. It is confidence. Specifically, the confidence that central banks and governments can manufacture liquidity on demand whenever the system faces stress. After 2008, markets learned that when systemic pressure appeared, policy would respond. Rate cuts, bond purchases, emergency lending facilities. The implicit promise that the machine would never be allowed to fully clear. That promise became the foundation everything else was built on, and it enabled the most dramatic expansion of financial claims in recorded human history. Total global debt now stands at approximately $346 trillion. The International Monetary Fund has placed global debt above 235% of world GDP. Debt issued at near zero interest rates for a decade is now rolling into a higher rate environment. The cost of carrying the existing claims is rising. The flexibility to respond, to cut rates again, to expand balance sheets again, is constrained by the inflation cycle the last round of expansion produced. The trap is not a future risk. The trap is the current position. Now zoom into silver specifically. The futures market is where silver's price is discovered. A contract is created representing 5,000 ounces. That contract can be bought, sold, rolled, netted, and settled. Most participants never intend to take delivery. The architecture is efficient, given one assumption. Most participants want the exposure, not the metal. So the system was built accordingly. Paper contracts can expand almost without limit, because the settlement convention assumes most will be offset before delivery. On top of futures sit ETFs, unallocated accounts at bullion banks, where you own a fractional claim on silver in aggregate, not bars with your name on them, bars in a pool, leasing arrangements, rehypothecation, using pledged collateral as collateral again for a separate obligation. These mechanisms are not hidden. They are how modern finance manufactures liquidity out of a constrained physical base, and they mean that the same physical ounce of silver can carry multiple economic owners at once, each with a legally valid claim, each with no reason to test that claim today. At the same time, the physical base is being pressured from the industrial side in ways that are structural, not cyclical. Silver is not a monetary relic that technology is replacing. It is embedded deeper in the real economy than at any prior point in history. A solar panel requires silver paste for electrical contact. There is no commercially viable full substitute. Electronics use silver for its conductivity, which is the highest of any element. Medical devices rely on its antimicrobial properties in applications where failure is measured in human lives. And the global push toward electrification, grid upgrades, EV infrastructure, renewable energy deployment, is a decade-long structural demand event. Meanwhile, the supply side is not responding. Mining is not a tap you turn. The time from discovery to production is measured in decades. Global ore grades are declining. Permitting environments are becoming more restrictive. The pipeline of new supply is not building fast enough to offset demand growth. So here's the arithmetic. Paper claims on silver are multiplying. Industrial consumption is structurally increasing. Mine supply growth is constrained. And the registered deliverable layer, the 87.17 million ounces positioned for exchange delivery, sits as a thin membrane between those two realities. That number is not what most people think it is. Registered is not the same as eligible. These are two separate inventory categories. Eligible silver meets the exchange's specifications, but has an owner who has not warranted it, who has not placed it into the delivery queue. That owner's intentions are invisible to you. They can decide the current price is too low to release metal, can withdraw it from the exchange system entirely. Eligible does not become registered on the market's timeline. It becomes registered on the owner's timeline, which is a very different thing. The effective deliverable layer, the silver that will actually be there when someone pushes on the system, is smaller than the dashboard number. The registered figure is a proxy, a pressure gauge reading, and right now, at 87.17 million ounces against the backdrop I just described, it is not reading abundance. It is reading stress. Stage 3 does not call ahead. By the time it is legible in the mainstream financial press, the first phase of the transfer is already done. What it sends is anomalies, small dislocations visible if you understand the mechanism and invisible if you don't. The first is the spread between paper price and physical price. When retail premiums are rising while spot is stable or falling, the paper and the physical are quietly diverging. Two prices for the same thing, moving in different directions, is not a sustainable condition. One is wrong. In a system where paper is created by agreement and physical is constrained by geology, the answer to which price is wrong is predictable. The second is the coverage ratio, open interest relative to registered inventory. When this ratio moves in the direction that should trigger institutional concern but doesn't trigger visible action, the machine is absorbing stress rather than releasing it. Stress absorbed is not stress resolved. The third is inventory movement, metal reclassifying from registered to eligible, the wrong direction if delivery demand were comfortably met. Large transfers between vaults. This shows up in publicly available data every day. Not dramatic, not headline-worthy, but it is a map of where the physical metal is moving. The map changes before the price does. The fourth, the hardest to quantify and the most important, is a change in the question market participants are asking. Stage 2 depends architecturally on almost nobody asking, what is the difference between a claim on silver and actual silver? The moment that question circulates widely among large institutional participants, the architecture is compromised. A world where that question is routinely asked and increasingly acted on is a different machine with a different failure mode. And that question is, right now, being asked with increasing frequency by people with increasingly large balance sheets. When the pressure gauge moves into the red, the system has three tools: physical expansion, new mine supply, scrap mobilization, large holders releasing metal, the slowest and most constrained path. In an acute delivery crunch, slow means largely irrelevant. Claim contraction, raising margin requirements, restricting new long positions, incentivizing cash settlement, shrinking the paper layer rather than growing the physical layer. You watched this in 1980. The exchange changed its own rules. Buying was restricted on a major commodity exchange in the United States, openly while the market was moving. That will happen again. Count on it. And price, The market clears upward until enough holders release metal, enough industrial users defer, enough paper exposure becomes too expensive to hold. In a market this constrained, with claims this multiplied, the clearing price is not close to the current price. These tools are deployed simultaneously in whatever combination the institution finds cheapest. But in every combination, in every scenario, the outcome for someone who holds physical metal is the same. The anchor reprices upward relative to the paper surrounding it. That is not a forecast. That is what has happened in every prior instance of this mechanism resolving itself, every single one. The objections are real, and you deserve to hear them. Eligible inventory as a buffer. The problem is that eligible flows when its owner decides the price is right, not when the market needs it. In a stress event, the incentive for an eligible holder is to wait. A reservoir is only useful if someone opens the gate. Cash settlement as a safety valve. Technically true, but if the demand for physical metal is itself a symptom of monetary anxiety, receiving dollars in lieu of metal does not resolve the anxiety, it reassigns it. The stress reappears somewhere else in a more acute form. Technological substitution, per-unit efficiency gains are real in some applications, but aggregate demand is intensity times volume, and volume in solar, EVs, electronics, and grid infrastructure is expanding faster than efficiency is reducing. And the biggest objection, this time is different. Modern risk management prevents these outcomes. The people running modern financial institutions are intelligent. The problem is not intelligence. The problem is incentive structure. Every Stage 2 expansion in monetary history was managed by people who understood the expansion would eventually face constraints. They kept expanding anyway, because the short-term cost of stopping was higher than the visible long-term cost of continuing. That is not a failure of intelligence. That is a rational response to a broken incentive structure. And rational actors responding rationally to their incentives is exactly how Stage 2 builds, every time, without requiring anyone to be a villain. So where does this leave you, practically? Stop hearing financial data as narrative and start hearing it as mechanism. When you see the registered inventory figure, hear liquid deliverable layer relative to outstanding claims. When you hear policy response, hear which is winning right now, the constraint or the incentive to ignore it. When you hear volatility, hear threshold behavior in a leveraged system building toward nonlinearity. The vocabulary shift changes what you see. Understand that the most dangerous moment in a leveraged system is not the obvious crisis. It is the calm before the nonlinear snap. That is the window when positioning is possible. That window has a specific characteristic. It feels like there is plenty of time, right up until the moment there isn't. Every person who navigated one of the historical transitions we discussed would tell you, in retrospect, that the signals were there, that the mechanism was visible, that the window was open longer than it felt like in the moment, and that once it closed completely. Be precise about what you actually hold. A claim on silver in an ETF is not the same thing as silver. An allocated account with documented, audited, segregated possession of specific bars is different from an unallocated account where you are legally an unsecured creditor to a bullion bank. A futures contract is not a bar in a vault. In calm markets, these distinctions feel pedantic. In a Stage 3 market, they are the entire question. Watch the mechanism, not the headlines. The signal is in the inventory reports, in the premium structure, in the delivery activity, in the coverage ratio. That data is public and available today. It moves before the price moves. By the time the headline reads what you expected, the first phase of the repricing is complete. Underneath all the historical detail, there is a simple human pattern that runs through every case study. There were always two groups. The first understood that the paper and the thing the paper represented were not the same thing. They held the thing, not with complete certainty about timing, but directionally, before the threshold crossed. They came through the transition on the right side of the transfer. The second group trusted the institution, held the paper, believed the anchor was secure, and they paid the adjustment cost. Not because they were foolish, because they did not understand the mechanism well enough to recognize which stage they were in. The pattern does not know your name. It only cares which group you are in when Stage 4 arrives. 87.17 million ounces of registered silver, in a world of record global debt, in a market where industrial demand is structural and growing, in a paper pricing system built to expand without limit, against a physical base that cannot be printed, cannot be manufactured, and cannot be argued with. That number is not a comfort statistic. It is a measurement of how thin the liquid layer is in the world's primary silver pricing venue. It is a ratio, not a quantity. And the ratio is telling you something specific. The pattern has 4 stages. We have walked through all 4 in 3 eras with 3 different forms of money. In each case, by the time Stage 3 was legible to everyone, the transfer was already underway. We are not at the beginning of this cycle. We are not at the end. We are in the part that feels like stability, but is actually compression. the part that has always preceded the nonlinear move, the part where the mechanism is visible if you know what to look at, and invisible if you don't. In the next part of this series, we are going to go inside the actual plumbing of the modern silver market. The specific vaults, the warrant system, the open interest engine, the policy levers that the institution will reach for first when the pressure gauge moves into the red, and the exact sequence of events that history says comes next. Knowing the 4 stages is the framework. Knowing the plumbing is what makes it actionable, and actionable is the only reason any of this matters. Subscribe. Be here for the next part. We are not at the end, we are at the transition. And the people who understand transitions before they become obvious are not lucky. They are informed.